Good, good evening. Can you hear me? Of course, it's a great pleasure and also a great honor to be here on this stage, surrounded by these four distinguished American authors. Some of you may ask yourself, now who is who, right? Because not all of them are that well known here already. Of course, the purpose of this evening is to change that, right? So to my right here is Kevin Powers, Jane Smiley, Rachel Kushner, and David Treuer. We have an hour, a little more than an hour, to talk with four authors who have written several books, many books. So it's kind of a mission impossible, really, to talk about their oeuvres in any depth. But the idea, of course, is for them to say a little about their work and for you to get an idea of these authors and their work, their ideas. The one author that you may know, don't mean to offend you, the one author that you may know, or the authors, because she has been published a long time ago in Dutch translation, is actually Jane Smiley. Some of you Flemish people in the audience may remember this beautiful journal, Nieuw Wereldtijdschrift, a long time ago, published by Herman de Koning. This is an issue from 1993 with contributions by women authors. For some reason, Herman thought we needed an issue with women. And there's an essay by Jane Smiley in this journal. In fact, that is how I got to know her way back when. And then many years later, Nieuw Wereldtijdschrift again published an essay by Jane Smiley about marriage, sex, and capitalism. So, of course, I'm sure you remember those pieces vividly. Rather than going into a biography, which is boring, though important, I'd like to read to you the introduction to an article that came out in the New York Times in 2014, it is actually, October 2014, where they wrote the following. Jane Smiley is the sort of writer who secretly drives other writers a little bit crazy. She's prolific and successful, untroubled by neuroses or blockages, with no messy blots of drinking or drug-taking on her resume. She seemingly writes the way her idol Dickens did, as easily as if it were breathing. The only unusual things about her are her height. She's 6 feet 2 inches, but looks even longer. And her obsession with horses, which I happen to share, which rivals that of Trollope, another of her idols. What's more annoying, now we get to the point, Miss Smiley made up her mind at an early age that she was going to master not just one genre, but all of them. She has so far published an epic, The Greenlanders, a detective story, Duplicate Keys, a tragedy, 1,000 Acres, probably her most famous book, which retells the King Lear story and won the Pulitzer Prize in 1992, a comedy and a romance, not to mention a racetrack novel, Horse Heaven, and one that recycles Boccaccio's Decameron, 10 Days in the Hills. Her new book is the first volume of a trilogy, one of the few forms left for her to tackle, and in characteristic workmanlike fashion, she has already completed the 2 other volumes, which will probably follow in the spring and next fall. That was 2014. 2 years later, those 2 volumes have been published. We're talking a trilogy of close to 2,000 pages about an American family, about America basically in the 20th century, ranging from 1920 to 2019. Okay, here's the obvious question after this long introduction. You did write an essay, beautiful essay, about what is a novel, in which you made this claim. The novel, I quote, "The novel was invented to be long, because what early novelists wanted to communicate could not be communicated in a shorter or more direct form, and also because length itself is enjoyable." End of quote. So, Jane, what is it that you wanted to communicate that required 3 volumes and 2,000 pages?
Well, I wanted to communicate how a particular family and individual members of that family would make their way through these 100 years. How sometimes their lives would be very personal, and sometimes their lives would be very public. They lived in Iowa, so if you live in Iowa, a lot of the family has to get out of town. So they would go away and encounter other adventures and other events. And for me, so I decided I was going to do it year by year. And all the years are equal. Because when you're my age and you look back, yeah, all the years were equal. And as I like to say, climaxes come and go. And that fascinated me about how they could go through extremely dramatic events, live through them, and 20 years later look back on them and think of them in a slightly different way. So these are ideas that I wanted to explore. But I also wanted to explore political ideas and ecological ideas. Because it's in Iowa, it's in a place where the nature of farming has changed completely over the last 100 years. I think that's very important. Every culture feeds itself in some way, and American culture has chosen to feed itself in what probably many people would consider a very strange way. So I wanted to explore that. I wanted to have babies. The story begins in the consciousness of a baby, and I wanted to talk about people growing up from birth to death and following their lives from birth to death. So it was not exactly a challenge that I set myself. It was more like I was so interested in those issues that I decided, okay, why not? I'll do it, and I set out.
Of course, when you write a book that is really 3 books, that is in fact, longer than some authors' oeuvres, one notion comes up immediately, and that is that strange notion of the great American novel. First of all, what is that anyway? And secondly, was this your shot at the great American novel? Was it ever on your mind? And what is this strange thing anyway?
Well, I think the great American novel is the novel that tells you the essence of what America is. But I don't think anybody can say that any particular novel is the great American novel, because if you're from Iowa, the essence of America is different than it is if you're from Arkansas or Florida or Oregon.
There's no such thing as an American cultural essence?
You do your best. But American culture is quite diverse. So, and also, I'm a firm believer in the fact that the reader is the boss. And so it doesn't matter what the novel is, doesn't matter how many times it's been called the great blah-bitty-blah novel. The reader can pick it up and say, ew, don't like that. Read 20 pages or something. The reader is the boss. So all the author can do is offer the reader something, and the reader can take it to himself or herself, or the reader can say, nah, Tolstoy, are you kidding me? What a bunch of bullshit. And that's one of the things I love about the novel, because it's quite freeing from the reader's perspective.
That reminds me of something you wrote in that same essay about the novel being, as you call it, inherently political.
Well, the reason the novel is inherently political, as opposed to, say, the short story or the novella, is that in order for a book to be very long, the character has to interact with the world around himself or herself. And so as soon as he starts or she starts interacting, then she will either fit in, or she will be destroyed, or she will overcome. And all that demands political theory on the part of the author. So if you take one of my favorite authors is Emile Zola, and he had a lot of political theories. And as we look back on his work now, we forget about the theories, and what we read is the stories of the people. But he needed the theories to back up the stories. And so I believe that if you're an author, you have to eventually have a political theory.
Is there anything, what is it that a novel or a novelist can do politically that politics cannot?
It just depends on chance. You know, one of my favorite American novels is Uncle Tom's Cabin, and it had a great political effect. But even though people remember the political effect, they don't remember what I consider to be the most important character, which is the character of the slave woman Cassie that Tom meets when he gets down to Louisiana. And she is enterprising, she's creative, she manages to escape, she manages to defy Simon Legree. And when I first read Uncle Tom's Cabin, you know, I'd broken my leg falling off a horse and I had nothing else to do, so I read Uncle Tom's Cabin. I'd never even heard of this character. And I realized that one of the injustices of American literature was that this extremely brave, sexually knowledgeable black women characters had fallen by the wayside. So she had a political effect on me because her political effect was to say, you know, intelligence is the key.
So do you think that, I know this is a huge one, do you think that American authors have any impact on American politics?
No. We wish, you know, we wish we did. But and some do, some don't. It's just a matter of chance. So we might want to, but then not be well enough known to have that effect.
Is it a matter of being well known?
Well, yeah, because the thing that happened with Harriet Beecher Stowe and Uncle Tom's Cabin was that the novel was taken up and widely read, and she enunciated ideas that people had about abolitionism. But the other thing that she did was when her characters went south to the plantation world, they were so human, especially the black characters, but also the white characters. You know, you had to sit back after you'd read this book and you'd say, oh, these people are human. And that's one of the political effects of the novel in history. That as soon as the novel began to be invented and developed, one of the things that readers learned was that other people had inner lives. And so if you're reading Roxana, Defoe's Roxana, or if you're reading Samuel Richardson's books, you know, you have to pause as you're reading a Samuel Richardson book and you have to say, okay, do I really want this character to be raped by her boss? She doesn't want to be raped by her boss. Maybe I should think about whether she should be raped by her boss. And so that gives the reader pause. And it gives all the little girls that are reading that book pause. Right. So that's part of the political effect, is to give you, the reader, me, the reader, an inner life where I think for myself. I feel free. I can make up my own mind about whether the owner should be able to rape the servant.
Your concern, if I can call it that, with the political dimension of literature goes beyond the novel. What I mean is you also write or wrote pieces occasionally sort of interfering directly with the way America is going politically. And I'm thinking here of a piece that you wrote in Slate magazine after the 2004 elections.
Oh, I didn't even remember that one. I was hoping you were going to talk about my experiences at the Huffington Post.
Oh, we can do that too. But first I want to run this by you. You wrote after Bush was reelected in 2004, the question was, why did Democrats get defeated 5 out of 7 times in the latest, recent American political history? And then there was this blistering line in that article which really struck me, and I quote, "The error that progressives have consistently committed over the years in America is to underestimate the vitality of ignorance in America." How do you
Yes.
feel today?
Absolutely. 100% more. I mean, this is evidence. This is evidence. We know that ignorance is promoted by people like Rupert Murdoch. We know that by Roger Ailes. And what can we do about it? We try to do things about it, but we can't. We don't seem so far to be able to do anything about it.
But you have to. I mean, you have to.
You tell
do
me how.
something.
You tell me how.
We only have an hour. I don't know. I mean, if you wrote this in 2004, then you must be totally.
Flummoxed? Is that the word you're looking for?
Yeah, completely desperate today. I mean, it seems like we haven't made any progress since 2004 in terms of political illumination, right?
Oh, no, we've digressed.
Right. But it's easy. I think it's easy, and I guess most people would sort of agree. We're all worried about it. There's not too many Trump voters around here. But the question is not to denounce it. The question is, how do you explain it? What are the causes? What makes a phenomenon like that possible? If the others want to chime in, feel free. I mean, we don't have to just nail on Jane all the time. No, but do you see what I'm saying? It's like,
Yeah.
what explains it? How is it possible that 8 years ago you vote for one of the most distinguished, sophisticated intellectuals in recent politics, and 8 years later?
Well, there's the racism aspect, and then there's also the Republican resistance aspect.
Which is the Republican resistance?
Well, the leaders of the House, on the night that President Obama was inaugurated, sat down and decided that they were going to balk every single thing that he did. Mm-hmm. They did not want there to be any progress because they didn't want him to win a second term. Mm-hmm. And so they just dug their heels in and decided to balk him at every turn. And so what am I going to do about that? I don't know.
I'll say something if that's all right.
Yeah, Rachel.
Just from out of the blue, the free radical over here. Well, two things. In terms of, progressives in the United States since 2004, in a way, with all due respect to a great hero of mine who's here, Jane Smiley, I think that there is an incredible arrogance on the part of the so-called progressives in the United States, even to call people ignorant without thinking that there may be some kernel of truth to their discontent, which has pushed them toward someone like Donald Trump. And I think that what happened in the UK, in a way, was really interesting because all these very, comfortable, educated, bourgeois people I knew in London were absolutely shocked that UK voted for the referendum. But if you talk to people in the North who work in factories, they feel quite different. And if you ask them about the EU, they can actually point out valid components of it that are anti-democratic. Not just not democratic, but go against some, fundamental processes. And in the United States, I think there are a lot of people voting for Trump whose lives are objectively worse than they were 12 years ago in 2004. I do a lot of work with homeless people in my neighborhood. I live near a place called Skid Row in Los Angeles. We have the largest homeless population in the United States. And the people that I work with down there love Donald Trump because they think he's, and I'm not justifying that at all, but why do they love him? It's not just ignorance, it's something else. They have fallen for his performance of straight talk because the Democratic Party and people like Hillary Clinton have always seemed to be part of an urbane, polished cabal of power that has a lot of rhetoric and has done very little for poor people in America. Now, when you get to somebody like Barack Obama, he's super handsome, he's highly educated, he's a sophisticated man, he's an intellectual. Oh my God, an elegant person's gonna run the country. What? In 2008, when people were suffering and lost their houses, and by the way, maybe in America, there's a perception that it was mostly poor whites who suffered in the subprime housing crash, but it was black people overwhelmingly lost their houses at a rate of like 600% that of white people. Obama bailed out the banks. He actually gave money to the banks that caused this economic crisis to begin with.
Bailout came before him. The bailout was before he was elected. The bailout was in the fall of 2008.
He administrated it once he came to power.
It was already passed.
I'm sure we will inevitably digress again into this quagmire. But before we do so, maybe I would like to draw David into the conversation. David Treuer, is born in Washington, and he has a very, very interesting background. David's mother was an Ojibwe, do I pronounce that right? Ojibwe, living on a reservation, working as a nurse at first. And his father was an Austrian Jewish survivor of the Holocaust. Now that is quite a complicated background, and David grew up on a reservation and still goes back to this reservation as I understand it, still has a lot of family there, teaches in California, has written several novels, and the most recent novel that I would like to introduce to you is called Prudence. Prudence is the name of a girl. The whole novel takes place in Europe, on a reservation in America. It's also, again, situated very, very explicitly in 20th century history, American history, European history, Second World War, even Belgium figures in the book. But I just want to, if you don't mind, go back to that sort of biographical aspect, because unlike most of us, I assume, you grew up on a reservation. We have a very, very limited knowledge, I think, and a very, very sort of thwarted view, maybe, of what it means to grow up on a reservation. So how is that different from growing up elsewhere in the United States?
We have 15 minutes, right?
14 minutes.
14 minutes. I'll make this quick. No, I don't know if I should address you or if I should address you, but thank you for coming. Thanks for the question. I don't know how to answer that question in any kind of concise way. Reservations are different. And one of there are many misconceptions about Indian reservations. Mm-hmm. And I could spend a lot of time talking about those misconceptions, or I could spend a lot of time talking about what my life was like. But then again, my life is only my own. It's not a typical life. Everyone's got a different take, right? Mm. But one of the things that people tend to think, both in America and abroad, is that they tend to perceive reservations as places in America, but not of it. Mm-hmm. Sort of these islands that are sort of stranded inside the vast sea that is our country. And they tend to think of them as places that are outside of time, untouched by history. Ever since the closing of the American frontier, reservations are seen as places that exist outside of time, and their only function is to contain Indian suffering. And that's it. They're sort of basins of eternal suffering. That's how they're most often understood. So when I tell people, like, where are you from? I say, well, I'm from Leech Lake. And they're like, oh, I'm really sorry. That's so terrible. And it's pretty common to get that reaction. And I don't know, I love where I'm from. And we love these places, like most Native people, we love our reservations, and it's not because they suck. It's not because they're horrible. Yes, we have lots of problems. Yes, there's chronic poverty, there's disenfranchisement, there's lack of access to capital, there's lack of access to education, there's inadequate health care. There's lots of things. We have lots of problems, of course. Mm. But we love them, and we love them for reasons that have nothing to do with difficulty. But in spite of all of that, we love these places.
But do you love them because there's a sense of community, of belonging there that may be lost elsewhere in the American land?
Again, I can't speak for other Native folk. I can just speak for myself. And I love, it's my home. Right. I understand the weather's moods. I understand the social rhythm of the place. I like the things I get to do there. I don't feel like I feel when I'm in Los Angeles, which is something of an interloper, I mean, Los Angeles produces this feeling in people that we are living on borrowed time because that landscape does not support human life, right? As soon as the state fails, it's going to get very ugly, and it's starting to.
I remember watching an interview with you where you said that the situation of the Native Americans or Indians, terms you use, sort of interchangeably apparently, has improved compared to the beginning of the 20th century. That, we like to think that it's sort of, on the verge of extinction, badly, badly treated by American politics, etc. But you once said that actually the late 19th century was a much worse period and that there's more people and it's a more vibrant culture now than it was in the past. How did that come?
Well, I don't know. In say 1901, there was legislation in place that was intent on parceling out reservations and destroying the land base. There was compulsory attendance for Native children in government-run boarding schools, whose purpose was to get Native people to stop speaking their native language, and to stop practicing their native religions, and to join the mainstream. Our religions, our native religions, were actually illegal until 1976 or 78 with the passage of the Indian Religious Freedom Act, which officially lifted the ban on native religions, which was put in place in the late 19th century. So is it better? Yeah. Our numbers have increased too, and our standard of living has increased, but it's funny, right? Because the conversation always comes back to trauma, right? And I feel like people tune into reservations because they're kind of addicted to it, and they treat reservations and books about them as trauma porn, as something meant to titillate and excite. So then they just move on. And so I always push back. And so at a lot of these talks, people say, well, life is very hard on reservations. And I said, well, at least, I'm glad I'm not from the Congo. I think things are much worse in the Congo than they are on Pine Ridge, and in Guatemala, and in many other places in the country, in the world, I mean. Things are much worse, but I don't know. People want us to sort of symbolize mistreatment as though that's our social utility. I think we have more to offer than that.
You have more to offer than that, which I guess is also an idea behind this book that you published called Native American Fiction. Of course, this is not a blank, at least for me, and I assume for many people in the audience. I mean, Native American fiction, you're concerned with the language and the preservation of the language. I mean, is that something that you are really worried about, or is it something you really want to communicate to the culture?
Well, he's talking about this book of essays of mine called Native American Fiction, or User's Manual, where I address a lot of canonical American Indian writers and their work. And I start the book by saying there's no such thing as American Indian literature. People were very angry when this book was published. And that was it was a polemic. And it was meant to sort of, to locate what we call American Indian literature in American literature, as American literature, as world literature. And to sort of, to prevent it from being further ghettoized as kind of an exotic boutique kind of thing.
Prudence, most recent novel. Prudence is the name of a girl in this book, and I'm not going to tell you anything much about this girl, but there's one thing that I would like you to sort of share with this audience, namely, what does the name of this girl, why did you choose this name, and what does it have to do with Hemingway to begin with?
Yeah, so when I was a graduate student, I was very poor, and I couldn't afford full-price books, so I would haunt the remainder table, and I would buy the biggest books for the cheapest price. And there was an 800-page biography of Hemingway, and I didn't give a shit about Hemingway. But I thought 800 pages, $4, it's a pretty good deal. And I read it, and so I'm reading this biography of Hemingway, and he says somewhere in the beginning, when the biographer was covering his youth, he quotes Hemingway as saying, this is a quote, "The first woman I ever pleasured was an Ojibwe half-breed girl named Prudence Bolton," end quote. And I immediately thought, bullshit. I think we know for a fact that Hemingway never pleasured anybody. right? I mean, I think we can assume that.
That's a fact.
That's a fact. You heard it here in Brussels.
It's science.
Right. And the biographer did some due diligence and provided a sentence about this real-life girl and said, yes, there was a Prudence Bolton whose tribe and whose family was near Hemingway's family estate in northern Michigan, and her father did perform jobs for the Hemingways, and she died when she was 19 years old after drinking poison with her lover, Richard Castle, and she was pregnant at the time. She drank rat poison and died a horrible, painful death. That's all we know about her. And so I remember that, and this was years ago. I read this, I don't know, 20, some more years ago, but it stayed with me, and I thought it was profoundly unfair that Hemingway's life is so thoroughly examined, and Prudence's life, and people like her, their lives are rarely examined at all. And so it stayed with me, and I wanted to know. There's no way to know what her life was actually like, and so the novelist's job, maybe, is to start where the facts leave off. And I wanted to know who she was. I wanted to know what moved her. I wanted to know, other than the obvious, why she would kill herself. So this stayed with me for a long time until I started writing the book.
So sort of an homage to this nearly forgotten.
Sure. Because Hemingway's not like me, but I could know her, you know? She could be a relative of mine. She's somebody I would care about. I don't care about Hemingway. Although he does show up in the book, and he gets it good.
In your own history, as in this novel, there's this double-track family narrative, Native American and Jewish at the same time. Is this sort of the most extreme form of outsidership one can possibly imagine in America?
It's the smallest tribe in the world.
Yeah, right. That's right. But that was very striking, that last word of your book, you know, the last one of the tribe.
Oh, yeah.
So I was thinking, is this what you're trying to say, something that is valid at once about Native American plight and the Jewish history?
Well, I don't know.
This total outsidership?
I don't think I have a plight. That's a word I would not choose to describe sort of the trajectory of both my tribe and my family, but it was my first attempt to bring the different parts of my life together, although it's not really a commentary on my life at all. No one knew what to call me, by the way, at university. I had a friend who was half black and half Greek, and he called himself Afro-Grecian. And he said, but I don't know what we're going to call you, you know? Like, Jewo-Indian, Indo-Jewin. He says, no, I know what your name is. He says, your name is Running Bernstein. And so, I don't know, someday.
Right. Another thing about the book, which again shuttles back and forth between Europe, Second World War, and America, and also shifts back and forth in time. It's clear that when we meet the characters in the present time of the novel, which is 1950s, they're all haunted one way or another by things that happened before. 1942, you know, during the war, right before one of the characters actually takes off to go and bomb Europe, basically, or some people in Europe. And what strikes me, and it actually sort of pertains to more of the books that I've read, America in the myth, in the ideology, is the land of the future, right? It is the land of the now, of the, you know, that's the myth, anyway. And it seems that in a book like Prudence, people are totally suffering from or determined by haunting memories, the past, things they can't come to terms with. I mean, to put it simply, there seems to be something un-American about that, right? The role, the weight of the past.
Maybe not. I mean, You've all seen Poltergeist. The entire country is an Indian graveyard. You know, the whole place is haunted, and there's a lot of guilt. So, in the particular case of the book, my father escaped the Nazis, and he made it actually escaped through Belgium as part of his journey, and wound up in the States. Ended up fighting in the same war that expelled him from Europe in the Philippines. My mother's father fought in France, and he fought here in Belgium. He was wounded in Aachen, just across the border in Germany. for me, in ways I've only recently begun exploring in this book, the war, and war more generally, has shaped my family in very profound ways. My father is a refugee, my grandfather is a combat veteran. The wars, that war in particular, shaped us and shaped my family. My grandfather emerged from the war a very bitter, very angry guy who didn't really crawl out of that until the last 10 years of his life. Only after I'd come here and he and I had sort of bonded over that, and we forged a relationship, and he became really, really quite sweet in the last decade of his life. But before that, he was rugged. And so this novel explores that. The ways in which we're forced to make choices we'd rather not make, and twisted into postures we'd rather not strike, and then we have to live with our own deformity and with the lies we're forced to tell and the lies we're forced to believe from others or encouraged to believe. It's very, very complicated for these people. It's very tough, you know. It's a novel of secrets in a way.
And of remembrance too, right? Memories that...
Or trying not to.
Right. There's a whole section in the book that takes place in Vielsalm. Have you been to Vielsalm?
Yes, I have. When my grandfather finally talked about the war to me, he didn't talk about combat, and maybe this is something Kevin can talk about, and certainly with more authority than I can. He wasn't interested in talking about combat. He wasn't interested in the kinds of things I was interested in talking about. He talked about a 2-week stretch of time when he wasn't fighting, and he said, I grew bored. I didn't have anybody to shoot, and I got restless. And so he explored all around this village of Vielsalm for a long time. He was there for 2 weeks. He got his shoes fixed by some guy. He met some children. That's the stuff he talked about. And so I went and found where he'd been bivouacked. I went to where his unit had been placed, and I explored the town. And it was really interesting to be there and to sort of... His war story was about a moment of calm, not about the stuff around it. And Vielsalm was that. Then they got pushed out, and then they left, and then the bad part of the Battle of the Bulge began.
Right. May we know what you're working on right now? That's always a difficult one. Is there a new project coming?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's nonfiction, which is a whole different thing. But yeah, there's another novel. It's about some twins, actually, who are veterans of the First World War, and they become assassins for the mob. These 2 Ojibwe assassins who were pretty good at their jobs. As in all brother stories, there's trouble in paradise.
Right.
So.
Right. And that's the new novel, which we will...
Oh, you won't see it anytime soon.
Not anytime soon. Okay. Let me introduce Rachel Kushner, sitting next to me, who's here mainly to talk about, but not only, about her most recent novel that was published in 2013 called The Flamethrowers. Her first novel was called Telex from Cuba, and it was a finalist for the America 2008 National Book Award, and so was the second one, The Flamethrowers, right? So that is pretty unusual that someone has the first 2 books on that very prestigious list. Again, this is a very long novel, complicated novel, ambitious novel, I want to call it, translated into Dutch. It's available. Is it translated into French too? It is. Translated into French. How many other languages do you know? Has it been translated into? The Flamethrowers?
I don't know, like 17 or 18?
17 or 18. Tells you something. It's impossible to really cover it in whatever little time we have left, but there's a few things I want to mention to give you an idea. The main character, in a way, in this long novel is a woman called Reno. Not really her name, but she was born in a place called Reno in Nevada, and so she's referred to as Reno a couple of times in the novel. One of the things she does, one of the things she loves is motorcycles. She's into speed, into driving fast, which you can do in America. And so we meet her basically when she drives this motorcycle across the Utah salt flats, participating in motorcycle races, etc. And then she moves and she moves into the New York art scene. She spent some years in the New York art scene. Love affairs, friends, art, it's all in there. She finally ends up in Italy, where she's become sort of mixed up in the leftist, autonomist movement in Italian politics. We're talking the 1970s. The book, again, is very much situated, like the other books we've been talking about so far, very specifically situated in time, 1976, 1977. When I was reading it, about this girl/woman driving around, meeting people, not quite knowing yet who she is, what she wants to be, etc., I had this strange association, which may freak you out. Is Reno your 1970s version of Sal Paradise in On the Road for the 50s? Is there this road novel element to it that Kerouac described in On the Road for the 50s? There was something,
I heard
about
you're a Kerouac expert.
even if I weren't, would that make a difference? Is that a comparison or a link that you ever made or that has been pointed out to you, or is it a totally off-the-wall thing to say?
No, it's not off the wall, but I was told that you wrote a book, you went to the sites and did the journey, right? And so you may be more in tune with certain subtle correspondences between
No, but I just mean in very general terms. There's that
Right.
sort of coming-of-age element to it, freedom, driving, speed, America. I mean, the
mean-
first part of the book, really.
Yeah, it didn't cross my mind. I mean, I read On the Road, but decades ago,
Right.
as a teenager, because my parents were of the Beat generation, and
Exactly.
that literature, meant a lot to them, and seemed like reading it could tell me something about them and their friends when they were young. And things creep in weird atavistic ways when you're writing, but I probably more influenced by other things. But and the novel, I mean, the road component of it is really just this one long chapter, and it's not even actually the opening chapter. The book opens, with a kind of Italian quasi-futurist in Alexandria, Egypt, around the turn of the century, when he sees this motorcycle and has a kind of primal, erotic moment, conjoining his desire for a young girl with the first motorcycle he's ever seen. And I wanted to think into what that would be like, because I'm interested in motorcycles as machinery that kind of figures through the 20th century, and I love them, and I, know something about them. So that's what that thread is sort of doing. But she's on the Bonneville Salt Flats because that's where the World Land Speed records are held. It's a very unique place. I think it's the only place like it of its kind. It's completely flat. It goes for miles. It's a baked white surface comprised purely of salt. And they've been running land speed vehicles there at this point for over 120 years. And I've spent a lot of time there myself. It's a very particular kind of light, and it's a phenomenal thing to watch those vehicles go off the line. And in the 1970s, there was a moment in the art world where it wasn't acceptable anymore to make a discrete object that you would sell on the market, like a painting or a sculpture. And so people started doing a lot of what was called post-studio work, and a lot of it was made in the West. People like Michael Heiser, and then Donald Judd later went to Texas and basically purchased an entire town. And there was a kind of fascination with sort of John Wayne cowboy aesthetic, and also a certain component of real estate to it, of acquiring large tracts of land. If not you, then a collector or a benefactor like the Dia Foundation. And the artist Michael Heiser made a piece where he took a motorcycle onto El Mirage dry lake bed and made these tracks and I saw photographs of it and thought, oh, my character could ride a bike at the salt flats. So, she has to get there from Reno. So maybe that part of it is the road journey, and perhaps it's partly comprised of my own experiences in the West, or what I think of as a kind of interiority that takes place for a person alone, moving very quickly, and yet submerged, in a world in Nevada.
But another element that sort of reminded me of that period, or that sort of literature maybe, is the style even. I mean, there's kind of a very sort of livid, lively, style. Reminds me, of course, Kerouac's spontaneous writing, the idea that,
I neither took a lot of speed nor typed it on a roll of toilet paper. It was totally sober. And
totally
done
sober.
with great care and deliberation.
Imagine what would happen if you went on Benzedrine or something. That'd be really wild. What or who are the flamethrowers that your title refers to? Maybe you could explain that to the audience. The flamethrowers.
It's kind of an open-ended title in a way, because it could refer to different phenomena or characters in the book. Most explicitly, it refers to a regiment of Italian soldiers who were in both World War I and World War II. The book refers specifically to flamethrowers from World War I, who would have been fighting when one of the characters' father was in that war. And he describes them at a certain point, the flamethrowers. He has these army guys, like dolls of flamethrowers, and they're his favorites. And his father explains to him that they are the most abject and the most loathed of regiments of Arditi, because they, first of all, cause instant death and destruction to the enemy, and because they are shown no mercy when they're captured, and they have to carry this incredibly heavy equipment, these twin tanks of fuel on their backs, and they wear completely asbestos outfits. I'm self-conscious because there's a military person on this stage, so. But I think that they've phased them out after the Vietnam War. They're also very bad for public relations. Apparently, incinerating entire villages doesn't look good on the news. So the United States did phase out flamethrowers, but not until 1975, so quite late. And this figure of a person who could cause great destruction, but also be a kind of social pariah in terms of his status in the military, was interesting to me, this kind of like a monster martyr type of figure. So there's that. But I told a friend of mine that the book was called The Flamethrowers, and he is very poet who's very flamboyant, and he thought it was just like fabulous people walking down the street in New York City, just throwing science and style, in every direction, which I thought was sort of amusing, because part of the book takes place in the art world and right. in a scene in New York in the 70s.
Right. Talking about that art scene, did you really live that art scene yourself? I mean, it seems like you knew. I mean, is this fantasy, or is this really based on your personal time in New York?
Yeah, that's a difficult question to answer. I mean, I was a child in the 1970s, and the character is an adult, and she's like going to bars and sleeping with people and staying out late, and I would have been, 8 years old at the time, so no is the first answer. But I grew up going to New York City because I had family there. My aunt is an artist, and she and her son both worked for an artist named Richard Serra, and this was in Soho in a time when Soho was actually, a dangerous neighborhood. It was dark there. There were no street lights, and we used to drive around in my cousin's truck picking up scrap metal and detritus off the streets. And I wasn't thinking in this manner at that age, and if I claimed I was, that would sort of seem a little pompous and like a lie. But looking back now, I understand that the detritus on the streets was from the manufacturing industry in downtown Manhattan. And by the mid-70s, that was ending. It was over. It died. And this supplanting of manufacturing by artists is a moment that I witnessed. And in thinking about it in retrospect, it took on great importance for me. But so I was around these characters, these artists. I knew people like Leo Castelli when I was a kid, and then I lived in New York as a young person in the 1990s, and I started writing about contemporary art just as a sort of side avocation while trying to figure out how I was going to be a fiction writer. And I met a lot of artists, and if you want to understand contemporary art, you have to know something about the discourses and the personalities of the 70s. It's all still quite, present for people in the art world. And a lot of those people are still around, so you can meet them. And a component of their art is the way that they present themselves and their personalities in a social space. So even though my own time as a young woman in New York came later, I was exposed to these people who were on the scene in the 70s, so it wasn't that difficult to reconstruct.
Right, right. Is it fair to say that you sort of take an ironic look at that art scene, that there's some kind of irony or some kind of, as if you're not really taking it seriously, at some of the theory and the pompousness, maybe?
Well, it's funny. People who aren't involved in the art world have tended to think that, but it hasn't hurt their impression of the book. Like, they think it's quite funny and that I'm poking fun. But I'm quite kind of embedded in the art world in New York City, and people in the art world think the book is like, at least from what I have heard, finally takes the art world seriously and gives an accurate portrait of what the 70s.
They're so self-obsessed they don't even get the humor?
I mean, a lot of the artists who were on that scene then have contacted me and written me letters, and people I was thinking of and was inspired by when I wrote the book, and that's been a great compliment to me. So for me, the art world is not a joke. I think that the discourses are quite interesting, but I think that humor is a huge component of the pleasure of writing. And there are funny things. Like, there's a guy who was, I think he was Swiss, who was kind of a little-known artist. I'm forgetting his name because I'm on this stage fright. Andre Kader, little-known artist from the 1970s, who kind of got recuperated for a moment, and he was written about a couple of times in Art Forum, which is like the big trade magazine of the art world. And he would paint these poles and carry one over his shoulder, like a huge long pole with barber stripes on it. And in this article that was written about him, they said, Andre Kader was turned away from a very important opening with a pole over his shoulder. And his subversive act was to try to go in with this pole, and they said, no, you can't come in. And so the article, with great reverence, said he went home, he picked up a toothpick, he painted his trademark barber stripes on the toothpick, snuck into the gallery, and left it on the floor. And it was considered like this great act of
Subversive.
total subversion. So I put him in the novel because I think that's funny.
Of course, that is very funny. That is very funny. Your main character then sort of, gets involved in these protest movements in Italy too in the 70s, which is of course, historically accurate movement. These things happened, and you of course use them in a fictional way. But the New Yorker asked you once about your interest in these social movements in America, but also in Europe. And then you said, and that was something that really intrigued me, and I quote, "I am interested," you said, "in the lost potential of Italy's movement of 77. It's come up again and again with Occupy, the movements in the Arab world, and the anti-austerity protests in Greece, Spain, Portugal. The world and its questions are ceaseless. Writing a novel is a way of synthesizing what presses in."
I said
End
that?
of quote. You said that. Isn't that beautiful? I was going to ask you to elaborate on it, actually. No, the short question here is, what is your expectation / belief in these social movements, resistance movements today, both in Europe and in America?
Well, let's start with Italy in the 70s,
Okay.
if we can. Because 1977 is like this kind of peak year for a social movement in Italy called Autonomia, which was many movements sort of grafted into one. And I didn't know very much about it until about 10 years ago. And my husband, who's more in philosophy and political theory and knows a lot of Italians, was writing about it, and I got interested, and I started asking people about Italy in the 70s. And it turned out everyone that I asked was involved with this movement, even people from the art world, like very posh gallerists in Milan. You know, I would ask about some poet, and they would say, oh, I helped him escape into France. And, you know, it was a time of a kind of reckoning when, I don't want to bore you with a long history of it, but the
We don't have
factory...
time for long.
All right. You know, it was a moment when it wasn't just assembly line workers revolting and students joining them, like in May 1968 in France, but when grandmothers, children, middle-class people, proletarian people, many people were involved in this movement, and it kind of almost tore Italy apart. So I thought it was worth
Right.
looking into.
I'd love to go on about this, but look at my watch. It's 9:20, and I should draw Kevin
course.
into the conversation. He's been so quiet. I feel embarrassed about this. But maybe there is a link here, someone. Kevin, welcome to this
Thank you.
group and this stage. Kevin was born in 1980, and grew up in Richmond, Virginia. You still live in Virginia, I understand. And Kevin Powers enlisted in the U.S. Army at age 17. And he served in Iraq in 2004, 2005, as a machine gunner assigned to an engineer unit. And it says, this is the official biography I'm reading to you. After his honorable discharge, Powers enrolled in Virginia Commonwealth University, where he graduated in 2008 with a bachelor's degree in English. However, of course, the reason why he is here is this book called The Yellow Birds. A book inspired by the war experiences in Iraq, right? You're deployed to Iraq. You're a fighting soldier in Iraq.
Yes.
You experience war violence firsthand.
Yes, this is true.
Were you ever injured yourself?
No, thankfully I wasn't.
You weren't. When, and how does one decide to turn an incredible experience like that, which most of us, of course, cannot even imagine, into a book, into fiction, into a novel?
Well, I think when all other avenues have failed, really, I mean, one of course takes the immediate steps of trying to sort of sort through an experience with that level of intensity, and in my case, they seemed insufficient to addressing the complexity of the experience. Having been a lifelong reader, someone who always turned to imaginative literature, particularly the novel and poetry, in a way it was sort of a last resort. I thought, well, if fiction and or poetry isn't equipped to contend with these kinds of questions, then I don't think anything is, really. So, and I think because there's a space for the reader, as Jane said, a huge space for kind of shared experience, this possibility for empathy to exist between reader and writer, I felt like there was an opportunity to share the experience with others in a way that allowed me to both sort of maintain my kind of personal privacy and ownership of the experience, but also let other people in on that, in a way.
Right. David mentioned something earlier about the inclination to think of reservation life Indian Americans in terms of trauma, but I can imagine that being in a war like that is really a traumatizing experience of a kind. Or am I wrong?
It's certainly unusual. I can say that for sure. Yeah, and I mean, obviously, soldiers don't have any kind of monopoly on trauma or tragedy, or loss, grief, anything like that. But I think there's a kind of intensifying effect of that sort of resulting sense of isolation or baggage, whatever you want to call it, because it's such a rare experience now. It's an experience not shared by many people. When David was talking about the generation that fought in the Second World War, it was very much a collective enterprise. And yeah, in the US, I've often heard it said that we speak of these wars as being the 1% wars. In this case, the 1% being the very, very small percentage of the US population that has either served or knows anyone who has served, or is really in any way affected by the decisions we make collectively to engage in these conflicts, but who ultimately don't feel any of the direct consequences. And so one of the things I was trying to do in the book, I mean, yes, much of the book is set in Iraq. It's about the narrator of the book doing things that he ultimately will wish he had not done, having to contend with the choices that he makes, but it's also about returning to a country in which one, I think, feels quite alien and separated from the vast majority of the population who don't think about this war. And, in a way, I guess I should add on that after thinking about it for some time, it's difficult for me to blame people for not wanting to think about war. I myself, I've been a veteran for 11 years, and I've tried really hard not to think about what we're doing even today in places like Afghanistan and Iraq. I don't know that that's the responsible thing for me to do, but it's easier, and I understand why people take that approach.
Right. What made you decide to join the Army age 17 to begin with?
Well, I mean, there's a sort of unspoken tradition of military service in my family that largely has to do with the kind of economic opportunities that were available to us. My father was the first person in my family to go to college. He went on the GI Bill, which basically the US government will pay for your education in exchange for military service. My grandfather served in the Second World War. I was a terrible student in high school. I much preferred, getting drunk and smoking weed after class, whatever. I had aspirations of some kind of education, but my record didn't indicate that I was worthy of a scholarship or anything like that. So, having this kind of family background, being slightly idealistic, perhaps a bit naive, I thought, well, in exchange for serving my country, which I still feel the impulse was an honorable one. I'll get some kind of life experience, and they will pay for me to go to some kind of state college, and so I did it.
So you did it?
Yeah.
But actually being deployed to a war was not really
It wasn't something that I was intending to do. I mean, it probably will make more sense. I joined the Army before 9/11, so the idea that there was no kind of imminent prospect of being sent halfway around the world to get blown up.
One of the things that struck me about the novel is its anti-heroism. I mean, it's about two young boys, who are fighting in Iraq, two friends, and without giving away too much, one makes a promise to the other boy's family that will go wrong in the end. And so there's the notion of guilt, there's the notion of friendship, but there's also this growing awareness or experience on their part that, there's nothing heroic about a war. One little line here nothing made us special, not living, not dying. And there are many instances like that. Is that something that you wanted to convey, that, you know, this misconception that wars are heroic affairs?
I mean, I suppose in a way, I believe there are certainly moments of opportunities for heroism and courage, etc. But they seem disconnected from the kind of reason that the war is taking place. It's because you love your friend and you don't want them to die, or a person is injured and you hope to help them. And it's kind of independent of any of the larger, the kind of political choices at which you are at the very end of. But yes, I mean, it's a very sort of elemental, basic kind of life, and these sort of meta concepts of heroism and valor, these sort of abstractions are not really present in the lives of your average 19 or 20-year-old kid who's both shooting and getting shot at on a semi-regular basis. Right. So people just don't think of that at all.
No.
Ever.
Did you hear from people you served with in Iraq who read your book?
I did.
And what did they think of it?
To be quite honest with you, I don't think they really gave much of a shit about the book. They were proud of me that I had sort of achieved something that I think the people who were close to me knew was important to me, something that I aspired towards. It's mainly been people that served that I didn't know, that I've gotten a variety of reactions from. Some people have identified with it very strongly, and some people have told me that, you know, they don't recognize their experience in Iraq at all in what I've done. And you know, when I conceived of it, and I suppose the aspiration I had for the book was that it would be one example of what that experience could be like. Right. Certainly, I mean, it's a relatively short book that mostly takes place in the mind of a 20-something Virginian. It's not meant to be kind of comprehensive as a description of the war in Iraq. That would require something much larger. What I was really trying to address is this sort of the individual process of attempting to take responsibility for one's actions and one's choices that I hoped would in some way reflect a process that could perhaps take place on a larger scale within the nation as a whole when we make these choices together of where to send our sons and daughters to go die.
It's 9:30, and this is a very profound comment. So I think we should leave it at that.
All right.
Kevin, Jane, Rachel, David, thanks for being here. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.